you're considering mounting an amp in your C6 Corvette, wanted to make this video. I guess it's a tutorial on the do's and don'ts and the different places of where you can possibly mount an amp. I wanted to talk about some different mounting points where you can consider mounting your amplifier. First of all, I think it's important to choose the best amp for your individual application. I decided to keep the stock Bose speaker setup because I think it sounds pretty good, and I only wanted to add a little bit more low end, so I wanted to add some subs. And in my case, I chose the Rockford Fosgate Prime 1200.1D. The main reason why I picked this amp is because it's small profile and high power. I have it powering two Fosgate Prime 10-inch shallow mount subwoofers, and the enclosure I purchased specifically recommended these subs for their dimensions and the sub enclosure volume specifications. After you decide on what amp you want to use, you decide on where you want to mount it. In the C6, there's a few logical spots to mount your amplifier. You want to decide if you want to have it on display or hidden. If you decide that you want to have it on display, perhaps building a mounting panel in the middle, right behind the seats, right here, would be the best choice. I would recommend building a panel where you could flush mount the amp. That way it hides all your wiring, and it could be flush with this ledge right here. That would look really nice. However, if you decide to hide your amp, the most common mounting positions are either behind the passenger seat, behind the driver's seat, or in one of the two storage compartments. Underneath where these subs are, in each corner, there's a little compartment where I know some folks have mounted their amps there. But what I chose to do is mount it behind the passenger seat. That way I don't lose any space behind my seat, so I can really stretch my legs out. And I don't know if you can see it, but the passenger seat is just a little bit further forward. And that's because there's an amp mounted behind there, and I'll show you. Oh, it's right there. I decided to mount mine here behind the passenger seat for a couple of reasons, and here are the reasons why I chose this location. One, it's hidden, it can't be seen. Prying eyes from thieves, they're not going to see it just walking by. Two, wiring the amp in this location is pretty easy. The power cables are shorter than running it to the back, which provides a little bit more efficiency. Also, keeping it on the passenger side, the battery is also on the passenger side. So really from here forward to where the battery is, it's not really that far. Another reason why I put it on the passenger side is so the driver's seat movement's not restricted. The one thing that's very important if you're choosing to mount your amp behind either seat is that your fuel tanks are right behind here. You have to be very careful when you screw your amp in, if you choose to screw it in, that you're not screwing into your fuel tank. You do have a few choices on how you want to secure the amp. One, you can cut a piece of plywood and place it behind the carpet, and you can screw into that plywood and just make sure that you have the right size screws, that they're not going to go through the plywood, through the thin fiberglass layer, and then into the gas tank. Since I have my amp turned pretty low, these speakers don't handle a ton of power. It doesn't generate that much heat, so I just chose to adjust the passenger seat all the way back far enough so that it holds the amp tightly in place. No one ever adjusts the seat, so the solution has worked well for me. Adding a piece of plywood in addition to the thickness of the amp, for me, would have caused me to lose another, let's say, 3/4 of an inch of space. It's very secure the way that I have it, and really hasn't moved in 4 years, so it hasn't been an issue for me. Now that you've decided on your amp and where you want to install your amp. Next, you need to decide on how you want to run your power cables. You'll need to run a heavy power cable directly from the battery, preferably 4 gauge. And you should also decide if you want to run your power cable either along the rocker panel here or inside the transmission tunnel in here. Either one would work, and what I chose, let's see if I can get up in here, if you can see it, right here. It's my power cable. So I decided to run it along this rocker, on the rocker here. And the reason why I chose to do that is because I wanted to keep it separated from the RCA signal cables, which run through the transmission tunnel, just to prevent any possibility of any engine noise. Because what happens is, if you run those cables too close together and the RCA cables aren't properly shielded, you get a little bit of engine noise. The amplifier will pick that up from the RCA cables and amplify it, and you definitely don't want that. In addition to your power cable, you'll also need to hook up a ground cable. That should also be the same gauge, 4 gauge, as the power cable. You'll also need to run a remote wire, which is a switching wire. It turns the amp on and off when you turn the head unit on and off. So you want them to turn on and off together. And you also need to run the signal cables, the RCA wires. Last, you'll need to run the speaker wires from the amp. They'll come back here to the subwoofers. So first, I'll start running the power cable from the battery. I use a red 4 gauge power cable. I also recommend using an inline fuse block or a circuit breaker that should be mounted fairly close to the battery. And you can see I have mine right here. When you're running this power cable through the firewall, you can either find a hole that's already there, or you can drill a new hole. Then you can start fishing the cable through the firewall. And once you have the cable fished all the way through, you can work your way inside the car. Okay, so once you've fished the wire all the way through the firewall into the car, you're going to start tucking it under these panels, run it along the rocker, and then down under the carpet. Let me show you. I went under the carpet, and then it comes out over here on this side, and then I connected it to the amp. And I grounded it. You can't see it, but it's grounded right here to one of the bolts that mounts the seat to the chassis of the car. And don't forget to run your remote wire right here, which goes to the head unit. I've seen some guys just jump the remote wire to the power cable, and that's a really good thing to do if you want to end up with a dead battery. After all your power wires are hooked up, next you want to connect your RCAs to the head unit, run them back to the amp. As I said earlier, I ran those along the transmission tunnel to the amp to keep them separate from the power cables. And then I connected the speaker wires, ran them from the amp back to the speakers under the carpet. Once all those wires were connected, I took the power cable, I cut off about 18 inches to 2 feet maybe, and then spliced in the fuse block here. So I connected the one side that comes through the firewall to this one side of the fuse block, and then the other side of the fuse block I connected directly to the battery. Then once everything was done is when I mounted my fuse. So that's it. It was very simple. and easy to install. As far as the amp and the speakers go, I highly recommend Fosgate Prime amp. It's awesome. It's got plenty of power, and those subs, they sound really good. Could have a little bit more low end, but they are 10s, they're not 12s. So I think for a 10-inch subwoofer, they sound really good.